Hello and welcome to a very special How I Paint Things. We're going to tackle the Deathclaws from the Fallout series. I've really been looking forward to giving this a shot because I was a wee fella when Fallout originally came along, and these things scared the absolute business out of me. Let's put it that way. Deathclaws are awesome, and I recall in Fallout 2 there were actually Deathclaw companions you could pick up, which is pretty awesome. These are not brute beasts, but intelligent creatures, and all the more scary for it. So this fella here comes from Fallout Wasteland Warfare by Modiphius, and he was sent along to me courtesy of Noxie, who is a viewer, and really wanted to see how one of these things would be put together and painted. And I gotta say, what a winner. I really enjoyed doing this. So all of the paints will be listed in the description below. But as I do point out this time, the colours themselves are not so important. So feel free, give it a watch, see what you think, and let's get started. Now, the first thing I've done is to hit him with a primer of matte black from the Army Painter. Any black primer will do, but it is worth quickly pointing out that the colours I'm going to use aren't really that important. What's more important is what I'm going to show you with sort of the belly and the soft parts of the Deathclaw. You could use a more warm tone, you could even use a brown to prime from and paint a much brighter version. Don't worry too much, don't get hung up on the colours. Now I have also changed the position of the Deathclaw on his base, because the example, they will give you a couple of drilled holes in the base, and on his feet there are pegs which will fit into those quite closely. It hangs over the base a little further than I like, so I got out a pin vise drill and just made a couple of fresh holes. You could even just trim the pegs off the bottom of his feet, sand them a little and glue them in place, but I figured the pegs were probably a safe bet, so I've left those in and just drilled some fresh holes. One thing I'm noticing about the sheer size of the Deathclaw is that keeping him in shot is actually quite difficult. We're going to start off by making him brown, and for this I'm going to use Catachan Flesh. Now this is quite dark, but it's got a little bit of sort of reddish warmth to it. You don't have to be careful with this at all. We're going to cover the entire miniature. Any little bits you find where you leave tiny wee bits of black in the recesses, that will be fine, although if you can, just paint the whole thing brown. Now something quickly I did want to touch on was that assembling this kit was actually super easy. I was a little concerned because you see, a company saying, oh, resin kits, aren't they nice? And if you've had no experience with them, then resin can be interesting when you take it out of the box. But I was actually really impressed with how well this fit together. There weren't really a lot of gaps at all. The only spot I had to spend a bit of time filling gaps was up around his neck here. And all I did was a little bit of extra super glue there. And yeah, if you can see that gap once he's painted, I'll be very surprised. So as far as resin kits go, this one's pretty nice. Now that's not going to take terribly long, and at the same time I've also just jammed a bit of this onto his base. It's going to be another couple of colours later anyway, but while I've got the brown out, I might as well make it easier for myself to paint that. Now when it comes to the difference between the scales on this fella and the belly stuff, there are a lot of variations on how Deathclaws ought to look. So what I'm going to suggest is that instead of slavishly adhering to what's in the game files, T-pose a Deathclaw and see what you like the look of, I reckon a little bit more colour looks better on the tabletop than it does on screen. So we are going to push this a little further than it might look in the game itself. So let's pop this fella down. I have here some Goldfag brown, yeah, there is a G in there, Goldfag brown. And I've got one of my makeup brushes. Reason being, as I always point out for dry brushing, you'll find this is really useful because it's got nice soft bristles. Now what I'll do is spin them around, and I am going to dry brush fairly lightly, but repeatedly, over the areas where I want that armoured plate sort of appearance. So you'll see after a few passes, I do build up that colour. And yeah, this is remarkably easy. Just make sure you haven't got too much paint on your brush. That's why I've got my little black sprayed box over here. But you can be more generous with this than you might think, because we are going to shade this later, and it's going to bring all of that together. Now we're getting somewhere. He's starting to look a little more like that huge git that attacks you when you first get the power armor in Concord. We've got lots of nice deep brown shading, but the orange tone that gives looks a little more like the in-game stuff to me, but viewed in reality. So yeah, we're going to carry on from this point. Now the best thing about makeup brushes is they normally come in sets, so I've got another very soft one here, and we're going to use some Tyrant Skull. And this time we're going to concentrate more along the spines and just very lightly on his back here. So all I want to do with this is to really start accentuating some of the more pointy, jagged bits, let's say. Goodness me, keeping him in shot, like I said, is a real mission. Now don't worry too much if you end up putting on what looks like a little too much here, since we are going to shade him fairly shortly. You don't have to worry if he's going to look a little bright. Now we'll grab some Yriel Yellow and we're going to paint in its eyes. And we'll do this now because if we do make a mistake, I can just go back to my Catachan Flesh and tidy up around the edges. No one's going to see the difference. So just a wee bit of this in here. Now another surprising detail at this stage to paint, we're going to stay up around its face and paint in the tongue. I have here Screamer Pink. And now this will probably be a little more normal than what I would ordinarily think looks right for a Deathclaw. But once we shade it, again, we're going to introduce a little bit of weirdness to this. You might choose instead to go for a real dark green. Have a look again at the in-game models for some inspiration. Now with some Morghast Bone, we're going to paint in his claws and toenails, toe claws. However you want to put that. Now what's interesting to me is that the claws and horns aren't the same color, which is interesting. It doesn't seem quite accurate to me, but hey, it's a mutated monster. Now there's a happy smile. I think I might have knocked a couple of teeth off while I was assembling him, so that's not a perfect smile. What I've got here is a little bit of Ratskin Flesh, and I'm going to use a large dry brush from the Army Painter for this. Now I knew I wasn't crazy, and I went and looked them up, and I'm actually looking at more of a Fallout 3/Fallout 2 Deathclaw look here. So what I'm going to do is just lightly dapple in that skin tone along his chest, belly, and up around his mouth. Now any areas that you end up leaving a little bit of the, the scale color behind, that's fine. Now that only took one coat because we don't actually want a really solid and straight edge to what we're doing here. What I want is a sort of ragged, more natural appearance towards the edges of these areas. So I don't want to overlap the scales, and in doing that, I leave a little bit of that brown gap in between. What we'll need to do now is actually a little bit of mixing. So we'll get out 1 dollop of Ratskin Flesh, and here roughly the same in Ungor Flesh. And then we'll jam those together. Maybe a little more Ungor Flesh, actually. There we go, that's better. And then using the smaller dry brush here, I'm going to apply this towards, basically as a highlight. So let's just flick this around his chest, but up towards the edges of the skin tone stuff, we're going to leave that darker Ratskin Flesh. Now this will look really ragged going on, but when we shade it, it's going to bring it together and it will look a lot more natural. So you see we're building up that soft belly. What I've got is a little flayed one flesh, and we're going to mix this straight into our skin tone color. And like I mentioned, it's important you don't really get hung up on the exact colors here. All you're looking for is maybe a bone color or something similar, and we're just going to apply this a little more sparingly to give some very rough highlights. You see, I still haven't swapped away from my dry brush here. I want ragged. Now finally for the belly, I've mixed in 2 dollops more of flayed one flesh, and we're just going to use this as a final highlight. Now this is really quite rough. As you see, I haven't been particularly careful, but I really like how mixing in each stage of highlight will give you a really natural transition of color. In particular, why I'm using these little brushes with a wedge tip is that when you come near like hands and what have you, you can use the edge to get a pretty rough little highlight there. Alright, that's looking pretty cool. We're going to move on now and paint the horns. Now, the New Vegas and the Fallout 3 Deathclaws have a more greyish kind of horn colour, and I quite like that. So we're really going for a bit of a mix of everything here. I've got here some Skaven Blight Dinge, though any dark grey which has a little bit of a green or bluish tint to it is going to work well here. So something like Hardened Carapace from the Army Painter would also be ideal. So let's just give these guys a quick coat. Sorry, every time I want to do the intro for this segment, all I can see is it just going, "Oh, give me a hug. Tell me what you learned at school today." Anyhow, so once you've got that out of your system, shake up some Seraphim Sepia really well. And I can hear some of you saying, "Why aren't you using Agrax Earthshade?" Simple answer, as much as I love it, Agrax would make this fella a little too dark. So we're going to apply, instead, Seraphim Sepia for our shading. Now we have got quite a bit of this already, because we've basically been dry brushing our highlights on. But to bring together some of these colours, introduced us a little warmth here. A quick layer of see, it's stuck in my brain. Seraphim Sepia is what we're using. Just over the whole thing. So scales, belly, everything. And then we'll leave this to dry for about 30 minutes. Now ordinarily this would be where I'd say that you've got a ton of shading, but we really had that already. What we've done is to tie together all of our little blotchy highlights and make things look a little more natural, and I'm quite pleased with that result so far. I do want to take it just a little further, so I have some Flayed One Flesh, and I've watered this down, not very much, just enough that it's going to flow a little easily off the brush, but I am going to use this and my little ragged brush here, just to dab in some areas that I do want a little more definition. So this chest, up along the arms and what have you. Now that's really starting to look the business. We'll turn again to our Tyrant's skull, and this time I'm just going to dry brush along his claws and really anywhere that I want just a little bit more sharpness to the highlight. So I am going to go over a couple of areas of the scales again and just flick a little more vigorously on his claws. Now while applying that dry brush, I did discover that there was an area I could finally make use of my Agrax Earthshade. So I very lightly dry brushed the horns in with some of this, and what I'm going to do is Agrax Earthshade over the top so they have a slightly darker complexion and shade than the Seraphim Sepia areas we did. Now, it's not quite dry, but I've still got plenty of time to work. What I'm going to do is to just paint in the base very quickly, just a couple of flat colours and a dry brush, and then we'll hit it with a matte varnish. We'll see what this beastie looks like when it is all finished. Now there we have it, our Deathclaw is complete, and my poor camera struggles to keep it all in the focus. It is a monster, really cool kit. I really have to admit I enjoyed this far more than I was expecting to. So I think the takeaway here is when you're painting monsters and unnatural things, rather than worrying about a nice sharp highlight in certain places, don't worry about it, just mix it up a little, splodge things on in a rough estimation of where they ought to go. You know, the belly scales on this fella in particular, just go for it. You know, there isn't a right place for any of this to go. And once you've shaded it, everything else falls into place. So thank you again to Noxie for sending this one along. Really appreciate the extra bit of help to make sure that this one could happen. I really enjoyed painting this Deathclaw. Thank you as well to Exit 23 Games for all the light and sound equipment, as well as all of the patrons who keep me ticking in paints and glue, including my wonderful producers, Alan Nuttall, Kyrie Crawford, Trainboy, Fred, and Jimmy. Your support really makes the difference. Any questions or anything, feel free to drop them in the old comments box below. My Twitter and Instagram are both linked there too. So I'm going to try and get some proper photos of this fella, and you all enjoy the rest of your day.